Freddy the Pig, To and Again, Chapter 19. The animals slept very soundly that night under the bridge, without a suspicion of the loss of their gold, or of the terrible fate that had overtaken Charles and Henrietta. Robert was the first to awaken in the morning. It had stopped raining, but a heavy mist hid everything from sight. "My goodness," said Robert, "it must be dreadfully late. I wonder why I haven't heard the alarm when it went off at 5 o'clock. Hey, Freddy," he called. "Hank, wake up. We ought to have been on our way 2 hours ago." In 2 minutes, all the animals were wide awake, and Freddy had gone out to see what it was that had stopped the alarm clock. Pretty soon he came running back. "The clock's gone," he panted, "and Charles and Henrietta are gone, and the phaeton is gone. Everything's gone. I bet Charles has run away with the treasure." "Nonsense," said Mrs. Wiggins. "He couldn't have if he wanted to, and besides, he isn't that kind of a rooster. I'm going out to see for myself." The other animals followed her, and when they came to the place where the phaeton had been left, there was no phaeton there. But they found prints of muddy shoes all around the place, and the marks of the wheels in the muddy road were as plain could be, so that they very soon knew what had happened. "Charles and Henrietta were asleep under the shawls," said Eek. "They made us get out. Probably they were captured in their sleep and didn't have a chance to call out to us." "Here's one of Charles's tail feathers," cried Alice. "He wasn't captured without a struggle, you may be sure of that." She was a great admirer of Charles. "We'd better start right away to follow these wheel marks," said Robert. "If we can find where the carriage has been taken to, maybe we can rescue them." So they followed the marks on down the hill, and they led straight back the way the animals had come from Florida, until they came to the road that went down to the house where the man with the black mustache lived, and they turned down that road. None of the animals said very much as they plodded along through the mist to rescue their friends, for they knew now that the man with the black mustache had stolen the carriage, and he was a dangerous and desperate character, whom it would be hard to get the best of. Even Mr. Webb was worried. "He's a bad man," he said to his wife. "He'd squash a spider as soon as look at him." And Mrs. Webb shuddered. Pretty soon they came near the house, and Jack said, "You'd better let me go ahead now, because I used to live here, and I know my way around." So he led them back the way around to the house, where they could peek in the barn window and see enough. There was the phaeton standing on the barn floor beside the rickety automobile, but the gold was not in it, and there was no sign of Charles and Henrietta. Although the mist was so thick they could not be seen from the house, they did not dare stay near the barn for fear that the man with the black mustache might come out and find them there. So the 4 mice said they would sneak up to the house and try to get in and find Charles and Henrietta, and the other animals went back and waited for them a little way down the road. After quite a long time the mice came back, and the animals all crowded round them eagerly. "Did you see them?" they asked. "Are they all right? Did you find where the money is?" "We didn't find out anything," said Eek. "We didn't even get into the house. I never saw such a house, not a crack to get in by anywhere, and all the old mouse holes with pieces of tin nailed over them. We couldn't even get down the chimney because there was a fire in the stove. He certainly is a mean man." "They're there, though," said Quick, "because we heard them talking, and Charles is there, too, because we heard him crying." "Poor thing," said Mrs. Wiggins. "But we'll get him out, if we have to tear the whole house down with our horns and claw the beaks and hoofs, won't we, animals?" "We will, we certainly will," cried the determined travelers. "But the first thing," she continued, "is to find out where Charles and Henrietta are, and the second thing is to find out where the money is, and then we can make a plan. Has anybody anything to suggest?" "I want to suggest something," shouted Mr. Webb, but nobody heard him, so he crawled down into Mrs. Wiggin's ear and stamped round until he tickled her, and then told her, and she told the others. He had an idea that he could get into the house through a keyhole if Robert would carry him up to the door. This seemed a good idea to everyone except Mrs. Webb, who thought it so dangerous. Indeed, she burst into tears at the very thought. "No, no, Herbert," she shouted. "I couldn't let you go. You said yourself he was a wicked man. Suppose he should see you and hit you with a newspaper or something. I should never forgive myself if I'd let you go." Mr. Webb, however, was firm in his decision, as spiders are apt to be, and having kissed his weeping wife tenderly on the forehead, he jumped down on to Robert's back, and they started. At the front door he got down, and while Robert hid behind a bush to wait for him, he crawled up and squeezed through the keyhole. It was gloomy inside because the windows were rather dirty, but that didn't bother Mr. Webb, and he walked up the wall as easily as you would walk up your own front steps, and then he walked across the ceiling to the front parlor, where he heard voices. The reason he walked on the ceiling was because that was the safest place for him to be. He knew that on the walls on the floor he was much more likely to be seen, but people hardly ever look up at the ceiling except when they are in bed, and then, too, if you see a spider on the floor, it is easy to run over and step on him, but that is a pretty difficult thing to do if he is on the ceiling. So Mr. Webb walked boldly into the front parlor on the ceiling. The man with the black mustache and the dirty-faced boy were sitting at the table counting the gold coins they had stolen from the animals. They could count 20, and then they would wrap them up in a piece of newspaper and pack them away in a big canvas bag. But they didn't get on very fast because they both counted out loud, and they kept mixing each other up and having to start all over again. Mr. Webb watched them for a while, and then hearing a noise in the far corner of the room, he walked over and saw Charles and Henrietta lying with their feet tied in a box beside the stove. Charles was laying on his back and staring gloomily at the ceiling, but Henrietta was picking busily with her beak at the knots in the string, and Mr. Webb saw that she was very nearly got herself loose. All at once Charles caught sight of the spider. "Hey!" he shouted. "Mr. Webb! Oh, my golly! I'm glad to see you. How did you find us? Are the others all here?" "What's the matter with those chickens?" said the boy. "Do you suppose one of 'em's laid an egg?" 18, 19, 20. That'll be the last egg, if it ever lays then," said the man with a coarse laugh. "Day after tomorrow's Sunday," he added meaningly. Mr. Webb hurried down the wall and climbed to the edge of the box. "For goodness sake, Charles, keep still," he whispered. "Henrietta, do you think you can get those strings off?" Henrietta nodded without stopping her work. "Very good, then," said Mr. Webb. "Get them loose enough so that you can get out of them quickly. But don't take them off, because it might be noticed, and I'll see what I can do. Cheer up, Charles," he added, slapping the unhappy rooster heartily on the back. "We won't desert you." On the wall, in a gilt frame, was a large picture of a man with a gray mustache, who was the father of the man with the black mustache and the grandfather of the dirty-faced boy. Mr. Webb walked down into the darkness behind this picture and sat down, cross-legged, on the dusty picture wire, and tried to think of a plan. But though he thought of a good many, there was just one thing the matter with all of them. They wouldn't work. "I'm wasting precious time here," he thought. "I'd better go back and tell the animals, and let them try to think of something since I can't." And he started up the wire towards the ceiling. But just as the edge of the picture frame, he caught sight of a fly. The fly was sound asleep. It had had a very hearty breakfast that morning of jelly and cream and egg that the man in the black mustache had spilled on the tablecloth at his breakfast. Then it had flown up onto the picture frame to take a little nap before going down to lunch on more jelly, cream, and egg. Mr. Webb, however, had not had any breakfast, so he crept up quietly behind the fly and grabbed it by the leg. The fly buzzed and struggled, but Mr. Webb held on, and then it stopped struggling and said, "Oh, Mr. Spider, good, kind Mr. Spider, please let me go. Please don't eat me. If you won't eat me, I'll do anything you want me to." But Mr. Webb had a very kind heart, and married life had further softened him, so that he paused, and when he was pausing, a thought came to him. "If you'll give me your word to do exactly as I tell you," he said, "I'll let you go. What's more, I'll go away out of the house and won't come back again. But if you don't do what I say, my wife and I and my relations will come and live in this house and will eat you all up." The fly promised, and Mr. Webb let him go. "Now," he said, "you go out and get all your relations and neighbors and meet me in the hall, and I'll tell you what I want you to do." So the fly slipped outdoors through the keyhole into the front door. Pretty soon he came back, and with him was all his family and neighbors, young flies and stout and middle-aged flies and old grandfather flies with no teeth, and an old grandmother fly with rheumatism in her wings. They came pouring in through the keyhole and formed in a wide circle round Mr. Webb on the hall ceiling. And Mr. Webb made a long speech and explained the situation and told them just what they were to do, and immediately they started in to do it. First they flew into the front parlor and lit on the ceiling. Then when Mr. Webb saw that Henrietta had untied the last knot and had got Charles's feet, as well as his own feet, free, he said, "Go!" And the flies jumped into the air and began whirling round the room, buzzing as loud as they could, and the youngest and most active ones pestered the man and the boy. 2 of the 3 of them would light on the man's nose and dance round with all 6 feet so that as to tickle as much as possible, and when he raised his hand to brush them off, they would fly over and tickle the boy on the neck. In a few minutes both the man and the boy were pretty nearly crazy. They stopped counting coins and folded up newspapers and tried to slap the flies, but as soon as they did that, all the flies would go up to the ceiling. And then as soon as they laid the newspaper down, the flies would start in again. "Fool!" said the man. "Whoosh! Get away! You! Get away! I don't see where they come from. There wasn't one here 5 minutes ago." "It's no good trying to swat them," said the boy. "Poof! Get out of my ear! They seem to be trying to get out of the window. Let's open it, and maybe we'll get them out." The man looked at the window, where 30 or 40 flies were walking round on the glass. "If it weren't for those animals, I'd open it," he said. "But I'm afraid they'll be round here some time after that gold. They're a pretty smart set of animals, and I shan't feel safe until we have taken the gold into the village tomorrow morning and put it in the bank. You remember what they did to us last fall?" "I'd rather have 40 animals in here than all these flies," said the boy. "Besides, we can watch if we see them coming, and we can slam the window down." And he went and unlocked the window and threw it open, and stood beside it to put it down again when all the flies were out. But although the flies streamed out by tens and dozens as soon as they got out, they went round to the front door and came in again through the keyhole, as Mr. Webb had instructed them to do, so that although they had stopped bothering, there seemed to be just as many in the room as they were before, and for every dozen that flew out of the window, 12 came in through the keyhole. "My goodness," said the boy, "there's no end to them. "Well, we'll have to leave the window open, that's all," said the man. "Come sit down and let's get these coins counted." And they started counting again, keeping a sharp lookout at the window. Now this was just what Mr. Webb had hoped they would do, and he mentioned to Charles and Henrietta, who had been peering anxiously over the edge of the box. The man and the boy were watching the window, so that they did not see their two prisoners climb cautiously out of the box and tiptoe towards them. Charles was almost dead with fright, but he followed Henrietta until they stood just under the table, and then, at a signal from Mr. Webb, the flies all whirled down and began walking up and down the man's nose and buzzing in the boy's ears and generally plaguing them, twice as much as they had before. And while they waved their arms to drive the flies off and shut their eyes to keep the flies out of them, Charles and Henrietta hopped on the window-sill and down on the grass outside and then ran for their lives. Then Mr. Webb went out into the hall, and the flies gathered round him, and he made them a little speech of thanks and then dismissed them. And as he followed the last fly out through the keyhole, he heard the parlor window go shut with a bang, and then the boy called, "Hey, Pa, Pa! Look, Pa, the chickens are gone!" He chuckled to himself. "That's a good job done," he said. "But now how are we going to get the gold?" Chapter 20. You may believe that Charles and Henrietta were glad to see their friends again, and that their friends were glad to see them. Charles shook hands with the dogs and Freddy and Hank and the mice, and Henrietta kissed the ducks and Mrs. Wiggins. She almost put Mrs. Wiggins' eye out with her beak. Then she would have kissed Mrs. Webb, but Mrs. Webb begged to be excused. "Now, animals," said Robert, "we've got to hold a council of war. We've got to get that gold, and we've got to get it before tomorrow morning, because Henrietta says they intend to take it into the village and put it in the bank tomorrow. And if they do that, we'll never see it again." "We've got to get into the house somehow," said Jinx, "and it must be after dark, when they can't see us. So the flies can't help us anyway, and they'll all be asleep. Now, how can we make them open a window or a door?" "Mr. Bean always opens a window for fresh air when he goes to sleep," said Hank. "You can take my word for it. This man doesn't do that," said Henrietta. "I never smelt such a stuffy house in my life." "Mr. Bean spilt some grease on the stove once," said Robert, "and he opened the window to let the smoke out." "Yes, but we can't get in to put anything on the stove," said Eek. "Wait a minute," said Jinx suddenly. "That gives me an idea. Yes, I know how we can work it," he said excitedly, and he explained his plan, which, as you will see later, was a pretty clever one, even for a cat to think of. Nothing could be done until late that night, so for the rest of the day the animals sat round in the woods, keeping well out of sight of the house. They tried to play cards to pass away the time, but home was so near, and they were all so anxious to get there, and so impatient of the delay, that the games didn't seem much fun. But at last the sun went down, and the long shadows crept out of the woods and hid the grass and trees, and the stars began to wink and twinkle in the dark blue sky. Even then the animals did not start to carry out their plan, and it was not until about 9 o'clock, when the light in the house had gone out, and they knew that the man and boy had gone to bed, that Jinx said it was time to go. Then they all went into the field that was near the house, and Freddy with his sharp nose, and Hank with the toes of his iron shoes, tore up by the roots a good-sized heap of grass. Then they carried up close to the house, and then Jinx took as much as he could carry and climbed up the back porch onto the roof and dropped it down the chimney. Then he went down and carried up another piece, and he kept on doing this until the chimney was all plugged up. Inside the house, the man and boy were sound asleep, with the bag of gold by the head of their bed. Fortunately for the animals, they had made up a big fire in the stove so that they wouldn't have to build a new one in the morning, and pretty soon the smoke that couldn't get up through the chimney began to pour out into the front parlor, and the front of the front parlor it went into the hall and up the stairs, and at last into the bedroom. And then it got into the boy's throat and woke him up. "Fire!" he yelled, jumping onto the bed. "Fire! Wake up, Pa! The house is on fire!" In a minute they were both up and rushing down the stairs in their white nightshirts, dragging the heavy bag of gold after them. Bump, bump, clink, jingle it went. They unlocked the front door and rushed out into the yard, and there they dropped the bag and sat down on it, panting. Then they looked up at the house. "Why, the house, it isn't on fire," said the man. "Where does the smoke come from?" asked the boy. "I don't know," said the father. "Must be a fire somewhere. We'd better get back and see." So they dragged the bag of gold back into the house, but they left the front door open just in case the fire could break out suddenly. The animals, who had been hiding beside the trees and bushes, now crept up close to that door, and as soon as they heard the man and boy moving round in the front parlor, they tiptoed into the house. Jinx and the mice hurried upstairs into the bedroom, and while Jinx carried the 2 pairs of shoes into another room and hid them under a bureau, the mice gnawed at the buttons off the clothes. Freddy and Robert and Jack hid under the dining room table, and Hank hid most of himself behind a long velvet curtain at the dining room window, although his head and tail showed. They made a good deal of noise getting in, but the man and boy were talking excitedly and throwing up windows to let the smoke out, and didn't hear them. Even then Mrs. Wiggins knocked over the umbrella stand in the hall, and they didn't notice it. When the animals were all in the house and Mrs. Wiggins had lain down in a corner of the dining room with a red tablecloth thrown over her, so as to look as much as possible like a piece of furniture, Jinx came to the head of the stairs and began to make noises. A cat can make terrible noises when he really tries, and Jinx was really trying. He moaned and groaned and howled and yowled, and in a minute the man and boy came out into the hall. They were very much frightened, and the animals could see their knees were shaking under the edges of their nightshirts. "Oh, Pa," said the boy, what's that?" "Here," said the man, "you take this bag of gold into the dining room and watch it. I'm going up to see." And he started up the stairs. The boy dragged the bag into the dining room and shut the door. All the animals stood perfectly still, and as there wasn't much light in the room, although it was bright moonlight outside, he didn't see them. But he did see Mrs. Wiggins. "Why, where'd this red sofa come from?" he said. "I never saw that before," and he went over and sat down on her. Now, Mrs. Wiggins had a sense of humor, and that means that she always laughs at the wrong time, and she began to laugh now. "Yow!" yelled the boy, and he jumped up, and forgetting all about the bag of gold that he had been told to watch, he ran upstairs to tell his father that the sofa in the dining room was alive. And at that moment Robert came out from underneath the table. "Now, it's our chance, animals," he said, and Mrs. Wiggins threw off the tablecloth, and Hank came out from behind the curtains, and Freddy and Jack came from under the table, and they all grabbed hold of the heavy bag with their teeth and heaved and dragged and pulled it out into the hall and through the front door and across the yard to the barn. As quickly as they could, they hoisted it onto the phaeton, and Hank took the ropes over his shoulders and pulled the carriage out into the yard. Jinx and the mice had sneaked downstairs again, while the man was looking through the bedroom, and they climbed aboard with Charles and Henrietta and the ducks. "All ready?" said Robert. "We're all here. Next stop is home. 1, 2, 3, go!" and away they went out of the gate and up the road with a rattle of flying stones, as fast as Hank could gallop, with the dogs and Freddy running alongside and Mrs. Wiggins thundering along behind, while all the smaller animals hung on for dear life, with beaks and bills and claws. Now the man had not found anything upstairs, and he began to suspect that a trick had been played on him. When he heard the rattle of the wheels and the thud of flying hooves, he was sure of it. He didn't say anything then to the boy for leaving the gold unguarded. He wouldn't give him his licking, for that came later. He rushed downstairs to the dining room, and sure enough the bag was gone. Then he ran to the door just in time to see the last part of Mrs. Wiggins going through the gate. "Get your clothes on," he yelled to the boy, giving him a cuff on the ear. "It's the animals. I might have known it, but we can catch them if we hurry. They forgot that we have an automobile." Now, it was easy enough for them to get their clothes on, but it wasn't all that easy to keep them on, for the mice had gnawed all the buttons off. They worked and worked at them for a long time, and finally had to fasten them together with pins. And that didn't work very well either, for every time they moved, the pins stuck them into them and made them yell. Then, when they were all ready, they couldn't find their shoes at all, so that they went out finally in their stocking feet and cranked up their rickety old automobile and started in pursuit. But this time the animals had got a pretty good start. But as they began to climb the hill on the other side of the valley, they looked over their shoulder, and far off down the road they could see the two little lights of the pursuing automobile, growing bigger and bigger, and they could hear plainer and plainer the rattle and the pop of the engine, as the man with the black mustache drove furiously on their trail. "I don't know as we'll make it," panted Hank. "We've got to make it," said Robert. "Keep going for all you're worth." But as they went on, it grew plainer and plainer that they could not make it, for the automobile was traveling twice as fast as they were, and just as they got to the bridge, where they had slept the night before, Hank slowed down to a walk. "It's no use," he said. "I can't run up that hill. Can't we turn off and hide in the woods?" "Not with a carriage," said Mrs. Wiggins. "But, Hank, you go on. I'll stay here on the bridge and keep them back. Go as fast as you can, and I'll overtake you if I can before you get home. And wait. I want the mice to stay too. I think they can help." At first the animals wouldn't consent to leaving her behind. "We'll stay and fight it out beside you," they said. But she said no. She had a good plan, and they'd only spoil it if they stayed. So they said goodbye sorrowfully and went on, leaving Mrs. Wiggins and the mice to hold the bridge. As soon as they were gone, Mrs. Wiggins set to work. She pushed down the railing on the side of the bridge with her horns and tore up some of the boards and piled them all in the middle. Then she and the mice sat down behind a bush and waited. Pretty soon the automobile came bounding up the hill, rattling as if it would fall apart any minute. And at every bound the man and boy let out a great yell, as the pins with which they were fastening their clothes with stuck them. Just in time the man saw the pile of boards, and he slammed on the brakes and stopped so quickly that he and his son flew right over the front and landed sitting down on the bridge. And at once they let out a piercing yell, for all the pins had stuck into them at the same time. Then they got up and began clearing away the boards. "How nice," whispered Mrs. Wiggins. "Out with you and do as I told you." And the mice kept out, and each one of them climbed up on a tire, and they set to work with their sharp little teeth to nibble holes through the hard rubber. "Pretty tough gnawing," squeaked Eenie. "Keep at it, brothers," chirped Quick. "Everything depends on it now." But the tires were very hard, and before any of them had made deep enough holes to let the air out, the boards were cleared away, and the men started up the engine. Then the mice had to jump down, and Mrs. Wiggins got up and lowered her head and shook her horns, prepared to charge at the enemy. But just as the automobile started slowly across the bridge, and just as she was about to gallop out and try to tumble it over into the water below, ping went the left front tire, and whizz went the right front tire, and the other two tires blew up with a bang, and the automobile wobbled and came to a standstill. For though the mice hadn't gnawed all the way through the tires, they had weakened them so that they gave way as soon as the automobile started. Then the man with the black mustache knew that his chance had gone, and that he couldn't ever overtake the animals and get back the gold. For quite a little while he stood staring mournfully up the road, but he was a practical man, which means that he believed in doing something immediately, even if it wasn't anything very useful. So he picked up a piece of board and took the dirty-faced boy across his knee and gave him a good licking, and then he turned round and walked home in his stocking feet. Chapter 21. Early the next morning, the head of Mr. Bean the farmer appeared at his bedroom window. The fresh morning breeze swung the red tassel of his white cotton nightcap and waved his bushy gray whiskers. He was looking out to see what kind of a day it was going to be. "My goodness," said Mr. Bean, "it's nearly 6 o'clock. I certainly do miss that rooster. I haven't been up on time one single morning since he left." He dressed quickly and went downstairs and out into the cow barn and gave Mrs. Wasburger and Mrs. Wogus their breakfast, and then he fed the chickens and the pigs and William, the horse, and the other animals. Jacques, the wise old collie, went along with him. Pretty soon Mrs. Bean rang the breakfast bell, and he went in and sat down at the table and tucked his napkin under his chin and had coffee and pancakes and hot biscuits and ham and eggs and oatmeal and 2 kinds of jam. And when he had enough, he pushed back his chair and lit his pipe, taking care not to set fire to his whiskers with a match. Then he said, "Mrs. Bean, I don't know how you feel about it, but I certainly should like to have those animals back again. It seems sort of lonesome here, this nice spring weather, without Robert and Hank and Mrs. Wiggins and all the rest of them." "Mr. Bean," said his wife, "I have heard you say that every morning after breakfast since the animals went away, and I will reply as I always reply. I miss them too, especially Jinx. He was a nice cat." "I've sometimes thought," said Mr. Bean, "that maybe they wouldn't have gone away if I'd been nicer to them." "You always was a kind man to your animals, Mr. Bean," said his wife. "Yes," he said, "I try to be. I gave them plenty to eat and didn't work them too hard, but after all, I didn't make them as comfortable as I might. All their houses need repairing, and they were pretty drafty and cold in the winter time." "Well, we didn't have the money to fix them up," said his wife. That's true, said Mr. Bean with a sigh, and for some time neither of them said anything. Then all at once, in the barnyard, Jacques began to bark, and the hens began to cackle, and the cows mooed, and the ducks quacked, and the pigs squealed, and Mr. Bean jumped up and ran to the window. "What on earth is the matter?" he exclaimed, and then, "Wife, wife!" he cried. "Here they are! Here are the animals back! Come out to the yard!" And out they rushed to welcome the wanderers. All the animals who had stayed at home lined up on either side of the gate to welcome them. First came Charles and Henrietta, wing and wing, and then came Jinx, proudly waving his red tail, and then Freddy and Jack and Robert, and behind them came the phaeton drawn by Hank, and Mrs. Wiggins, and then Alice and Emma and the 4 mice on their back brought up the rear. They marched in the gate and went through to the barnyard, while the animals and Mr. and Mrs. Bean cheered themselves hoarse. And then they stopped the phaeton directly in front of Mr. Bean, and Robert jumped onto it, and with the help of Jack and Mrs. Wiggins, tumbled the bag of gold out on the ground. "What on earth?" Mr. Bean exclaimed, as he went down and untied the bag, and out rolled a stream of bright yellow coins. "Gold!" he cried. $20 gold pieces! Why, there's thousands of dollars, enough to build 20 new barns if we want 'em. And you brought all this back to me?" He stood motionless for a minute, and then he snatched off his nightcap, which he had still on his head, and threw it up in the air and grabbed Mrs. Bean round the waist and waltzed her round the barnyard until they were both so dizzy they had to stop. All the animals cheered and danced around too, and then Mr. and Mrs. Bean went round and hugged all the animals, even the mice, who were very happy, but scared all the same to be hugged so hard. And when the alarm clock and the shawl and the other things they had brought back with them had been admired, Mr. Bean made a speech. "Animals and friends," he said, "I thank you 1,000 times for this magnificent and munificent gift. Had you brought me back nothing but yourselves, I should have been more than happy. But since you have brought me wealth as well, I intend that you shall share in its benefits. You shall have new homes fitted with all the modern conveniences. The workmen shall start on them tomorrow, and Mrs. Bean and me will draw the plans for them tonight. Those of you who work regularly shall work in the future no more than 6 hours a day, and when, as it is sometimes necessary, either Hank or William works longer than that, he shall have an extra measure of oats and sugar for each hour of overtime. Since I have an alarm clock, Charles may sleep as late as he wishes in the morning. I will have an electric light strung up over the duck pond, as well as various houses, and a small house will also be built for the mice. And perhaps next winter we can all go south together. And now, my friends, you are no doubt anxious to greet your relatives and talk over your adventures by flood and field, so today we will do no more work, and we will celebrate it as a holiday in the honor of your homecoming. No doubt, too, you are hungry, and Mrs. Bean will give you in and prepare a feast for you while I set to work on the plans for our new quarters. Again, I thank you, my friends, from the bottom of my heart." That night, when the celebration was over and the animals had all gone to bed, Freddy the pig, who had eaten a great deal more than was good for him, and consequently did not feel like sleeping, walked out into the moonlight. "After all," he said to himself, "it's exciting to travel and have adventures, but there's no place like home." And he looked affectionately at the old familiar pig pen where so many happy hours had been spent, and then he made up this song. "Oh, a life of adventure is happy and free, and danger has its charm, and no pig of spirit will bound his life by the fence on his master's farm. If there's no true pig but heaves a sigh at the pleasant thought of the old homestye. But one tires at last of wandering, and the road grows steep and long, a treadmill round where no peace is found if one follows it overlong. And however they wander, both pigs and men are always glad to get home again." The end.